In the early summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht launched a new offensive in the Soviet Union. From Kharkov in Ukraine, a German assault force began its advance eastward. As in the year before, the troops advanced deep into the country, but the appearance of rapid success was deceptive. The width of the front line on which the units had to operate increased 2.5 times, with troop strength decreasing daily. Fall Blau, the operation's code name, demanded the utmost from the soldiers. They had to advance as far as the Caucasian oil fields on the Caspian Sea and cross the Don River in the process.
In 1941, the first major campaign had just failed. It had not succeeded strategically, it had not achieved its operational goals. And now suddenly something happened that Hitler had not reckoned with, that he certainly didn't want. The war had not only become a world war, but it was dragging on. They knew they had to plan for years now. It was not enough to say the war will last until October 1941. Suddenly, it was unforeseeable how long the war would last. And that's why it became a matter of economic areas, of strategic resources which Hitler believed you had to have in order to be able to continue the war for a longer period of time.
The initial weak resistance of the Red Army caused the commander-in-chief to make a fatal decision, to the horror of his generals. Hitler split the already strained Army Group South into two parts. While Army Group A continued to advance toward the Caucasus, Army Group B was to secure the northern flank along the Volga.
Hitler believed, however, that once the offensive was underway, the Russians would be defeated. They would run away and Russia would collapse. And so he split the direction of the attacks. And now it included Stalingrad and the Caucasus as targets. Army Group South was split up, and that massively overextended the German forces. That was an operational error of the first order on the part of Hitler.
Although all the generals predicted a disaster for him, the dictator insisted on the need for the operation. In August, he met a high-ranking visitor at his headquarters. Hitler wanted to persuade his ally, Tsar Boris of Bulgaria, to enter the war against the Soviet Union. The Führer urgently needed support for his latest plan. The most important goal of the war was no longer the conquest of living space, but oil. "If I don't get the oil from Maikop and Grozny," said the dictator, "then I will have to liquidate this war." But the Tsar refused.
The Bulgarians traditionally had a very close relationship with Russia. There was the religious connection, there was the cultural connection, and that's why Tsar Boris III said he would take part in the German war, but not against the Soviet Union. Also at that time, the Bulgarians were an important occupying power in Yugoslavia. They also sent troops there, they fought there. They also fought in Greece, but they were the only ally not fighting against the Soviet Union.
Hitler vastly underestimated the Red Army's striking power. He assumed that the enemy had largely used up the mass of his reserves in the first winter of the war. The Russians, said the dictator, were at the end of their strength, but the opposite was the case. Georgy Zhukov, a competent strategist, became Stalin's deputy commander-in-chief in August. The Red Army was now also training partisan units. They were supposed to sabotage the invading Germans behind the front. Thanks to Allied arms deliveries, the quality of the equipment, as well as the training of the soldiers, constantly improved. The fighting strength of the Soviet units increased. It was evident for the first time in Stalingrad.
Stalingrad was of enormous geostrategic importance. It was located on the Volga, and the Volga was the lifeline of the Soviet Union. The oil came from the Caucasus, had been transported across the Caspian Sea to the center of the Soviet Union via the Volga. At the time, Stalingrad itself was a city of heavy industry and important weapons factories. That's why Stalingrad came into the operation planning. In the first drafts of Operation Blue, it said, you just have to eliminate Stalingrad, somehow stop the traffic of the Volga. Eliminate it. This was actually achieved in August 1942, when they reached the Volga just north of Stalingrad. And then it became more and more important. It had a symbolic value. It was simply Stalin's city. And then the meaning actually changed. It was no longer about an economic geostrategic meaning, but about conquering the city as a symbolic political act. Because they had not conquered other symbolic cities, they had not conquered Leningrad, they had not conquered Moscow, so now, so to speak, this symbol of victory over Stalin with the conquest of his city had to happen.
Hitler pulled together all his remaining forces to achieve this goal. In the meantime, German tanks were running out of fuel in their hunt for oil in the steppe region of the Don. Smaller units had reached the oil wells of Maikop, but not enough for the urgently needed supplies. Frustration often resulted in outbreaks of violence. On their way, the troops left behind a trail of devastation. In this modern war, more civilians died than soldiers.
Soldiers had endured wading in the blood of the front line for many years. And the special phenomenon was, we talk a lot about post-traumatic stress disorders nowadays, with the missions abroad. Of course, an incredible number of soldiers of the Wehrmacht had post-traumatic stress disorders without this finding. But most of them had obviously developed incredible resilience. The actual thing that needed to be explained was not that people were traumatized in a medical sense. They were traumatized soldiers. They were in the minority. The majority built resilience and were able to live with dying, killing and fighting, at least to the point where they could live a reasonably normal life again afterwards.
Dass sie danach wieder ein halbwegs normales Leben führen konnten.
The carnage was successfully suppressed. The downside of the war was played down for the Volksgemeinschaft. Here, we see how the war wounded and frontline fighters are cared for in Munich's English Garden. The Nazis knew very well the psyche of their people, wrote a judicial official Friedrich Kellner in his diary in the summer of 1942. Confidence in victory only lasts when victory follows victory, assuming that the end of the war is in sight. The people don't care how that is achieved.
The point of cabaret evenings, Wehrmacht film screenings in particular, was to give soldiers opportunities to stop thinking about the war, to dream about a different future and to think about the time before the war again.
In fact, since the beginning of the campaign against the Soviet Union, every third German soldier had been reported wounded, missing, or dead. Unmoved by this, the Nazi leadership in Munich staged a parade of troops on a grand scale. The regime knew how to stir up public opinion. Nazi Germany was still only receiving reports of success from the front. Being possibly defeated by the Bolshevik enemy seemed unthinkable. People were confident of victory.
On the one hand, morale in Nazi Germany was high for a long time because people were still relatively well off. On the other hand, there was definitely great ideological fervor in the population. People believed in the final victory. They believed in the Führer. They believed in the goals of the war. A certain well-being plus a belief in the goals kept the population united for a very long time. Plus, any kind of resistance was brutally punished, suppressed. There was no free media, no critical reporting, so it was difficult to form an opinion about what the real situation was. Perhaps one was aware of one's immediate surroundings, and even the news coming from the field was all censored. There was definitely great ignorance among the population about how bad things really were.
Hitler had given the order to Colonel General Friedrich Paulus to conquer Stalingrad. The Sixth Army was advancing on the city. Italians, Romanians, and Hungarians had to secure the flanks. On the way to the Volga, they soon experienced acute supply shortages. The condition of many of the divisions were already critical and visibly deteriorating. More than 1 million Wehrmacht soldiers had already been reported killed, wounded, or missing in action. Exhaustion was spreading. The march of more than 1,000 kilometers had left the men at the edge of their endurance. They had no idea what lay ahead of them.
Research has shown that the Germans were already completely weakened when they faced Stalingrad, that they were at the end of their tether, that the units had already been bled dry, that they had supply problems. They had started to starve even before the city was closed in, while the Soviet Union was able to deploy massive reserves there, and the Foreign Army's East Department completely misjudged that.
On August 23, 1942, Luftflotte 4, Air Force 4 under General Oberst von Richthofen began bombing the city. 600 bombers dropped explosive and incendiary bombs for days in 1,600 sorties. 40,000 civilians died. All that remained of Stalingrad was a field of rubble. On September 3rd, the first German units reached the outer ring of defense.
And then the Red Army dragged the Germans into a house-to-house battle that involved extremely heavy losses. And now, on top of that, the Red Army was fighting a battle at no matter what the cost. The fact that they outnumbered the Germans, that they constantly counterattacked, had huge losses, and even though the Germans were outnumbered, they managed to capture the city. And although the attackers were superior, the toll in blood was immense. For Stalin, it was also about symbolism. My city must not be captured. To put it bluntly, Stalin was smothering the German advance in the blood of his own soldiers.
Stalin erstickt den deutschen Vormarsch im Blut der eigenen Soldaten.
In accordance with Stalin's orders of don't take a step back, Red Army soldiers who were accused of lacking combat readiness were put in front of a firing squad. Stalin expressly forbade the evacuation of civilians from the city.
The Soviet Union would have had to pay a much smaller toll in blood had it not been for the decision made by this dictator. Until 1942, all of his decisions were wrong. He forbid soldiers to retreat. He ordered units that had no ammunition at all and could not continue fighting to continue fighting. He had had dozens of generals shot for failure. He basically ruled everywhere with fear and terror and believed that a frontal assault was the only way to win a war. Not to mention that he was influenced by very archaic ideas of honor and masculinity. All of this made no military sense at all, and he only listened to his generals now and then after the Battle of Stalingrad. The idea that people today associate Stalin as the dictator who was the great strategist of the Second World War is completely wrong. People associate his name with victory in World War II, but without him, there would have been a greater chance of ending this war sooner.
Aber ohne ihn wäre die Chance, den Krieg eher zu beenden, größer gewesen.
Stalin ordered the 62nd Army to defend the city unconditionally. 200,000 civilians had to build defenses and barricades in work columns. Nevertheless, the Germans succeeded in pushing the Russians back to the banks of the Volga. Soon, they had conquered about 90% of the city. In the course of the battle, 500,000 Soviet soldiers died in a hail of bullets. The NKVD executed another 13,500 Red Army soldiers for alleged desertion.
What Stalin was displaying there was complete contempt for his own people, and the generals as well. Maybe not all of them, but many generals really had no regard for casualties at all. It was only crucial that in the end someone was left holding the flag high, and that this could be counted as a victory. It's pretty dramatic what happened there, how people were sometimes sent into the fire and were burned. The Germans noted with shaking heads in their field reports that at points where there were already masses of dead or destroyed tanks, even there the generals sent their troops into the fire again and again. So you have to say that with many Soviet military leaders, there was a complete contempt for the life of their own soldiers.
At Hitler's refuge at Obersalzberg in the summer of 1942, reports of successes from North Africa were also coming in. At the Berghof, the dictator welcomed his ally, Benito Mussolini. A year earlier, the latter's disastrous conduct of the war had prompted Hitler to send German troop units to North Africa. After alternating offensives on both sides, the operations of the Axis powers against the Allies were extremely successful. The goal of Operation Theseus was the conquest of the Libyan fortress of Tobruk, an important port in the Mediterranean. Hitler's favorite general, Erwin Rommel, had been able to achieve surprising success time and again since the beginning of the North African campaign. The vast desert plains enabled his armored troops to conduct long-range operations in a fast-moving war, and then Rommel set out to conquer Egypt.
In May of 1942, Rommel's tank army was properly supplied for the first time. Sufficient supplies had arrived via the Mediterranean, and Rommel decided to launch a major offensive. He bypassed the British positions at Gazala, took Tobruk by storm, something he had not been able to do a year earlier, and advanced across the Egyptian border to El Alamein, 80 kilometers from Alexandria.
Und dringt über die ägyptische Grenze bis nach El Alamein, 80 Kilometer vor Alexandria vor.
The deep-water port of Tobruk secured supplies for the German troops across Libya. The victory had cost the Afrika Korps heavy losses. Its inventory of tanks was severely depleted. Next, Hitler wanted the Wehrmacht units to occupy the Suez Canal. Rommel's top commander was already planning to advance from there further into the Near East and India to gain access to the British colonies.
Britain's entire position in Middle East actually hinged on the defense of Cairo and the important port of Alexandria. And surprisingly, Rommel had just managed to conquer Tobruk in the summer of 1942, and then very surprisingly continued to invade Egypt. And then the big question was, would he, in a final effort, manage to get to Cairo as well?
Die große Frage, wird es schaffen, einem letzten Anstrengung nach Kairo zu kommen?
Just one day after winning the Battle of Tobruk on June 21st, Rommel was promoted to Field Marshal General. At the age of 50, he became the youngest to hold this rank.
Auf dem Flugplatz des Führerhauptquartiers. Generaloberst Rommel trifft aus Afrika ein.
The newsreel propaganda knew how to seize the moment.
Der Sieger von Nordafrika sprach auf Einladung von Reichsminister Dr. Goebbels vor Vertretern der in- und ausländischen Presse über die Ereignisse auf dem nordafrikanischen Kriegsschauplatz. Der Marschall erklärte unter anderem: Dank der Tapferkeit unserer Soldaten sind wir in einem harten Ringen mit dem Engländer fertig geworden, obwohl unsere militärische Kraft ihm zahlenmäßig oft unterlegen war.
Es folgten harte Kämpfe am Ras Madauer, vor allem im Mai, die beinahe mit Kampfverhältnissen vor Verdun zu vergleichen sind. Aber der deutsche Soldat und neben ihm auch die italienischen Kameraden haben diese schwierigen Zeiten überstanden, haben jeden Versuch, die Festung Tobruk zu entsetzen, abgewehrt.
Marschall Rommel meldet sich beim Führer und empfängt aus seiner Hand den Marschallstab.
In July, Rommel wanted to finally win the African campaign and ordered the armored units to continue their rapid advance. But the Allies prevented them from circumventing their positions again and met the German troops at the decisive battle at El Alamein.
The British set up defensive positions at El Alamein, and that was very well chosen because to the south was the Katara Depression, where the Germans couldn't deploy their armored forces. Thus, in early July, the British succeeded in thwarting Rommel's breakthrough attempt at the First Battle of El Alamein.
After the rapid advance, the tank army's supplies and fuel were largely depleted, and the supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and the soldiers were exhausted. Rommel knew that he had to be able to penetrate the Allied defenses in one swift thrust and prevent retreat.
Ende August entschließt sich Rommel ein letztes
At the end of August, Rommel decided to attack one last time in order to perhaps reach Alexandria, the Nile, and the Suez. He attacked, but after 48 hours his offensive had more or less failed. The British had managed to bring in enough reinforcements.
Verstärkungen heranzuführen.
In the meantime, their air force had gained supremacy over the German air force, and so Rommel then had to retreat once again to his initial position.
At the beginning of November, the field marshal had to admit that he had lost the second battle for El Alamein. When he learned of Rommel's order to retreat, Hitler was beside himself. You can show your troops only one way. Either victory or death was the Führer's radio message. But the field marshal had the radio traffic cut off during the retreat. A warrant for Rommel's arrest was not enforced. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of German and Italian soldiers were taken prisoner of war by the Allies. To mark the victory, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill arrived for a troop visit at the British 8th Army and was celebrated.
El Alamein
was the first great victory for the British. They had really beaten Rommel decisively this time. It was not victory in North Africa, but Rommel was now forced to retreat all the way to Tunisia. It was also the last battle fought by the Commonwealth alone against the German Empire. In the future, Britain would fight battles together with their US ally.
Nur noch zusammen mit dem US-Verbündeten schlagen.
The US was still fighting its battles in this war exclusively on the islands of the Pacific. In the war against Japan, they were about to leap across the Pacific. Next target, Guadalcanal. Here, the Japanese had built an airfield. From this strategic position, Japanese long-range bombers could easily attack the sea route that connected the US with Australia.
The battle for the Solomon Islands and for the main island of Guadalcanal represented a very important building block in American strategy, the so-called strategy of island hopping. The idea was to approach the Japanese mainland island by island from the south.
For the first time, US forces went on the offensive against Japan. They had prepared for months to capture the enemy strongholds in the Pacific.
The Japanese and the Japanese military were, of course, aware of that, and that's why Guadalcanal was also heavily contested. It was very clear to the Japanese that this was a very important building block for the American strategy of island hopping, and of course also for American strategy when it came to securing Pearl Harbor and Hawaii.
The US Marines accomplished what was previously thought impossible, crossing onto the beach from their ships under fire from coastal batteries. After landing on August 7th, they initially encountered little resistance, but the Japanese would not admit defeat. For half a year, they continued to launch new offensives. The Battle of Guadalcanal went down in US military history as one of the longest and most bitter.
There was the Battle of Guadalcanal, which had been fought for months in the countryside, which was very bloody and very racist. Hardly any prisoners were taken by either side. It was a very drastic battle that went on in the Solomon Islands.
Marines showed their trophies as a sign of victory. The Americans lost nearly 1,500 GIs in ground fighting, the Japanese nearly 15,000. The victory on Guadalcanal secured for US forces an important launching point for future operations. On the other side of the world, the Soviet allies were getting ready for their decisive offensive. Stalingrad was to be that decisive place. More than 200,000 soldiers of the German Wehrmacht and its allies were entrenched in the ruins of the city on the Volga. Reports from reconnaissance planes of heavy Soviet troop concentrations on the opposite bank of the Volga were ignored by the Supreme Army Command. The Sixth Army waged a hopeless battle over a wasteland of rubble.
Der Krieg der Wehrmacht in der Sowjetunion war ja ein Bewegungskrieg, ein Krieg in riesigen.
The Wehrmacht's war in the Soviet Union was, after all, a war of movement, a war in huge spaces, a war in which tank formations surrounded each other, a war that actually did not take place in build-up zones at all, that did not take place in cities at all. The Germans had no rules for fighting in cities. You didn't fight in cities. There were actually very few examples before Stalingrad where the Wehrmacht fought in cities. Now the units were coming into the city, an industrial city, destroyed by German air raids. They weren't prepared for that, and it was very bloody. They should have been called off, but Hitler persevered. And so battalion after battalion was wasted there. The interesting thing about that, and this is overlooked, is that the defenders were outnumbered. Usually, the attacker has the upper hand. But here, in the fighting in the city of Stalingrad, around the train station, around the tractor factory, the Germans were outnumbered, and yet they managed to capture Stalingrad. That showed that craftsmanship, the art of war, the German divisions that were deployed there, they had mastered their craft. But the number of casualties was immense, and of course it was operational nonsense to fight for the last mound of rubble in Stalingrad.
Die Opferzahlen waren natürlich immens und es war natürlich operativer Unsinn, jetzt auch noch mit den letzten Trümmerhügel in Stalingrad zu kämpfen.
Rat war is what the soldiers called fighting in the houses. The Soviet defenders turned every foxhole, every ruined house, every intersection into a fortress from which an unexpected attack could be made. Snipers deliberately executed German soldiers by ambush. The city on the Volga had to be held at all costs.
If Stalingrad had fallen, the front line would have been along the Volga, and that would have been a preliminary decision to extend the German Empire to the Volga and to have access to the Caucasus, and thus to the Middle Eastern countries, which were potentially sympathetic to Germany, such as Iran, for example. On the other hand, that was a prestigious city. It was clear to Stalin that the city that bore his name must not fall. And that's why the Red Army's draconian and cruel measures were particularly extensive in Stalingrad, because of its importance. Here too, one could have said that the Red Army could have taken the city from the beginning. They could have retreated. They would not have had to defend house after house, with an unbelievable number of casualties that exceeded several times the German casualties, and where a Red Army soldier had a few days' chance of surviving.
At the beginning of November, the Wehrmacht had still not succeeded in breaking the Soviet resistance. The Red Army only held about 10% of the city. The Foreign Army's East Department reported that the Soviet Union had no reserves left. Hitler ordered the breakthrough with shock troops. The Führer ignored the concerns of his general staff.
Hitler would not accept turning back. No, we must somehow save ourselves from the situation. No peace agreements. Diplomacy had not been used in this war for a long time. It was either hold, or forward. That was what the Führer, who was also the military commander-in-chief, wanted.
Das ist eine Haltung, die auch auf die eigene Bevölkerung, auf die eigenen Volksgenossen, auf die eigenen...
This was an attitude that he extended to his own people. His own people, his own soldiers. He didn't care how many German soldiers fell or were wounded. The main thing was that the oil fields of the Caucasus and the Crimea would be captured or held. That was the most important thing, and those who did not cooperate had to bear the consequences. In Adolf Hitler's mind, this relentlessness was not only directed against external enemies, but also against his own people. If that was the case, then the German Empire, German society, would perish with him.
Das Deutsche Reich, die deutsche Gesellschaft, untergehen.
Hitler brushed aside General Paulus's warning of a major Soviet offensive. On November 8th, he announced the imminent victory at the Löwenbräu in Munich.
Ich wollte zur Wolga kommen, an einer bestimmten Stelle, an einer bestimmten Stadt, weil dort ein ganz wichtiger Punkt ist. Den wollte ich nehmen. Und wissen Sie, wir sind bescheiden. Wir haben ihn nämlich. Es sind nur ein paar ganz kleine Plätzchen noch da. Nun sagen die anderen, warum kämpfen Sie da nicht? Weil ich kein zweites Verdun machen will, sondern weil ich das lieber mit ganz kleinen Stoßtrupps mache.
On November 19th, the Red Army struck back. 4 days after it started, Operation Uranus closed the pocket around Stalingrad. The German troops were doomed. As early as June, Churchill and Roosevelt met in Washington for a planning conference. The British and the Americans promised Stalin help in the fight against the Wehrmacht. The opening of a second front in Europe was intended to relieve the Soviets.
At this point, Churchill and Roosevelt made important strategic decisions. Namely, they said, opening of the Second Front, they wouldn't do it in 1943. They would not land in France in 1943. That was always Stalin's hope. Instead, they would first stabilize the Mediterranean region. And there, with the fall of Tobruk, it was really burning for Churchill. And therefore, one said, one will land with the available means in North Africa, Operation Torch, that is, in Algeria and Morocco, in order to stab Rommel in the back and to stabilize the Mediterranean area. And at the same time, one had to then try to support the Soviet Union to make it materially stronger, because they would not land in 1943 in France. That would only come in 1944.
The Red Army was generously supported with weapons and equipment. The Soviet Union and the Western Allies were now officially allies.
The distrust was always there, of course, this capitalism. This unequal alliance would certainly not have come together if there had not been a common enemy. And that's what the National Socialists were hoping for right up to the end, saying that this unequal coalition couldn't last long. It's bound to break up at some point. But what they underestimated was that a common enemy held this unequal coalition together until the enemy was at last gone.
Mobilizing against this enemy was also a subject for the film industry, especially in the United States. To convince the American public of the need to intervene in the war in Europe, the U.S. Army commissioned a series of propaganda films. From 1942 to 45, director Frank Capra, who had won multiple Oscars, made 7 films entitled Why We Fight. Designed to be shown to American GIs, the series were eventually shown in public cinemas.
Worldwide Army release alone requires 225 prints per subject.
Prelude to War or Nazis Attack were the names of the works that earned Capra another Oscar in 1943 for Best Documentary. They were intended to convince the American nation of the ruthlessness of the enemy, according to the commentary.
And for those who don't like it, you don't eat. Or you disappear into a concentration camp. Or you get this. And this is the man who gives it to you.
In den Vereinigten Staaten stand man vor dem Problem.
In the United States, the problem was to motivate war against the Germans, whom many Americans liked. In contrast to propaganda against Japan, it wasn't possible to fall back on existing racial prejudices.
Dieses Problem löste man, indem man eine Zeit lang
This problem was solved by differentiating between Germans and Nazis. But the longer the war went on, the less willing people were to differentiate between Germans and Nazis, and propaganda messages had to be communicated in a catchy way, which was not conducive to differentiation.
Botschaften mussten ja auch eingängig vermittelt werden, was der Differenzierung nicht dienlich war.
To defeat Nazi Germany, the Americans and the British prepared to land in North Africa and embarked from North America and Britain for the crossing to the Mediterranean. The GIs had no idea what lay ahead of them. For most, the journey to war began as an adventure. Many had never been away from home. They had no combat experience whatsoever. Operation Torch began on November 8, 1942. The plan called for the simultaneous landing of American and British troops around the key ports of Morocco and Algeria, Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. Protected by banks of fog dispersed by fighter units, the soldiers approached the coast in assault boats. One platoon, 36 men, fit into each boat. The boats raced ahead at a speed of 9 knots. The new technique of the amphibious landing, which the Americans had used successfully for the first time in the Pacific War, proved to be extremely effective.
When the Allies landed in North Africa in Operation Torch, Hitler didn't decide to withdraw from North Africa, but sent reinforcements to Tunis. And so the fighting in North Africa continued for another 6 months. However, more than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were taken prisoner in the process.
For these men, the war was over. The relief can be seen on the faces of the Italian soldiers. the disastrous course of the war in North Africa contributed significantly to the decline in power of their Duce Mussolini in the coming year. On November 10th, U.S. troops surrounded Casablanca, Morocco, which was held by forces of the pro-Hitler French government. Since Vichy France had refused to enter the war on the side of Nazi Germany, the Americans had hoped to meet no significant resistance. In fact, the colonial troops surrendered on the same day. There was no fierce battle like the one that took place in Stalingrad.
In North Africa, people were dying by the thousands. So the idea of the chivalrous war, perhaps half the truth. What we can say is this was not an ideological war. The murder of prisoners, which was commonplace in the Soviet Union, that didn't happen. The mass murder of civilians, partisan warfare, all of this did not exist in North Africa. Of course, there were civilians in North Africa. There was also forced labor. Libya was, after all, an Italian colony. There were even Libyan Jews who were taken to the mainland and killed there. But the character of the war in North Africa was ultimately a completely different one. The scale was completely different. So if you look at World War II as a total war, we find relatively few traces of it in North Africa.
Dann finden wir davon eben relativ wenige Spuren in Nordafrika.
Rommel's Africa Corps had to withdraw all the way to Tunisia. Now, the Allies threatened to stab him in the back. In Oran, the defenders had surrendered on November 9th. In Algiers, members of the resistance simultaneously staged a coup against the military of the Vichy regime, which was allied with Nazi Germany. Field Marshal Rommel's troops were now coming under pressure. Nevertheless, German propaganda continued to portray him as a glorious commander, probably because the Desert Fox had been able to turn seemingly hopeless situations into surprising victories on several occasions.
North Africa was probably the theater of war where it went back and forth the most. There were several German offensives. There were several British offensives. The game ball there was always the so-called Cyrenaica. It always depended on how far the respective side could supply its troops. That is, if one side advanced further, it went further and further away from its supply lines, and the other, which retreated, got closer to its supply lines. And that's how the whole thing came together like a rubber band. It went back and forth all the time.
The British 8th Army, commanded by Bernard Montgomery, advanced from the east, and the newly arrived U.S. forces, commanded by Dwight D. Eisenhower, advanced from the west. The German troops were entangled in retreating battles and faced a double superiority. To escape total annihilation, the Germans had to retreat further and further. German troops and their allies recorded about 250,000 dead, wounded, and prisoners at the end of this battle. Meanwhile, a secret conference took place in Casablanca, Morocco on January 14th. U.S. President Roosevelt arrived and inspected an honor formation of the American Armed Forces. Afterwards, he met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and together they set the invasion of Italy as the war's next objective. To end the war, they demanded no less than the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. Stalin agreed with this demand.
Die Alliierten hatten ja 1943 auf der Konferenz von Casablanca erklärt,
at the Casablanca Conference in 1943, the Allies had declared there could be nothing other than unconditional surrender. In other words, it was clear to everyone there was only total defeat or victory. There couldn't be anything in between. The war could only end with Germany's unconditional surrender and occupation. So now you have to put yourself in the head of a Prussian officer. It was inconceivable that someone would surrender without the last bullet having been shot.
Und dass es da keinen Ausweg gibt. Und das hat Hitler auf perfide Weise ausgenutzt, dass man sich diese preußischen...
And there was no way out. And Hitler exploited this in a perfidious way. These Prussian notions of honor and rank were exploited to get these people to keep fighting. It may have been an error on the part of the Allies, but they had learned the lesson from the First World War. If this must not happen again, then there must be no way out of it. But on the other hand, hopelessness is always something that drives all dictators all over the world to the extreme.
Dazu bringen lässt, es bis zum Äußersten kommen zu lassen.
While Nazi propaganda denounced Allied policy as a war of extermination against Germany, German troops in North Africa lost battle after battle in the spring of 1943. The defeated enemies were interned in prison camps for the rest of the war in accordance with the Geneva Convention. The British and Americans were now able to decode almost all German radio transmissions and were therefore well informed about Axis plans. The German defeat in North Africa was only a matter of time.